Hello, dear friends, and welcome to this first in a series of webinars from Women Weaving the Future, where we will be exploring the life and works of Abdullah Öcalan, his paradigm, and what this means for women's struggle from the perspective of the global women's struggle. Today is the birthday of Abdullah Öcalan. And as such, this is the first webinar that we want to present to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about who he is, his life, and the background to the really important role that Öcalan has come to play for international struggle and women's revolution. And to speak to you tonight, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Haveen Gunesa. Haveen is an engineer, a journalist, and a women's rights activist. She writes and speaks extensively about Abdullah Öcalan, his situation, and has translated several of his books. She's also one of the spokespeople for the International Initiative for Freedom for Öcalan, or Peace in Kurdistan, which is a multinational peace initiative for the release of Abdullah Öcalan, which was established immediately after he was arrested in 1999. Following a conspiracy of various secret services. And this initiative has various different works, including the publication of Öcalan's works and also raising awareness and campaigning for his release. So without any more introduction, I will hand you over to Haveen. Welcome, Haveen.
Thank you very much indeed. This is, of course, not a very easy topic to take on, as the period from the 1970s until today is pretty complex and multi-layered. But I will give it a shot. And of course, at various other times, there has been various other ways of looking at who's Öcalan. So I hope to complement this. As you said, today is Abdullah Öcalan's birthday, so it's pretty befitting that we should be discussing this. He's now 72. I just want to say on behalf of the initiative as well, that each day is one day too long that he's in there. This is something that makes our resolve even stronger, that he and the Kurdish people be free and this grave injustice finally ends. The pain and indignity inflicted by the colonial powers of the world and of the region has to end. And this is why the Kurdish people, women, and other oppressed groups and their friends are celebrating Öcalan's birth all over the world today. They are planting trees, holding discussions on his revolutionary ideas, among other things, just as we are doing today. This became a day to be celebrated after the abduction of Öcalan in 1999. The more Kurdish people were told to disavow him, the more they actually embraced him through days such as this. It is a day to reiterate their call for his freedom and to show that their freedoms are inextricably connected. These celebrations are thus a declaration that their representative or guide, he would like to be called, Reber Öcalan. But of course, it matters the most to understand how they interpret this day and why. I guess there are many ways in which we can describe Abdullah Öcalan. Above all, he is a human being. Sometimes this gets forgotten in all the heated discussions. He is the founder of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. He is a political prisoner in absolute isolation, a Kurdish politician with the widest sport. He is indeed a philosopher, a prolific writer, an author with more than 60 books, with 12 of them having been written in prison between 1999 and 2010. He has created a body of theory that ranges from the mechanisms of direct democracy to a sociology based in quantum physics, to a multi-volume world history focused on the Middle East. He's someone who is able to bring theory and practice into unity. He has been the architect of several peace processes, an inspiration for Rojava Revolution, Shengal's resistance, and the HDP project. A rebel or a guide who has used his authority, not only within the movement, but within the whole of Kurdish society to shift the support for traditional male hegemony to the support, active support and systematic support of women's freedom and struggle and breaking of that male hegemony. I guess I could go on and on. However, I fear that these really may not make enough sense if we do not go back and look at how things happened. Who is Öcalan, the person who was born in this day 72 years ago? Öcalan says that he has indeed had 3 births. Thus, it might be interesting today to look at him through these births. It is as if Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in his book, Love in the Time of Cholera, wrote these lines for Öcalan. Human beings are not born once and for all on the day their mothers give birth to them, but life obliges them over and over again to give birth to themselves. Thus, in line with this idea of births, which Öcalan has often talked about himself, let me divide my talk today into these 3 parts. The first birth, which is his physical birth, continues until the 1970s. His second birth, the birth that he has made by transforming himself and the founding of the PKK, it goes on from 1970s to 2000s. And his third birth, the birth of democratic civilization paradigm, has happened from 2000s to date. But in order to get a better picture of this birth, we need to situate the Kurds and the times and the conditions under which he was born, which may be good for the future seminars that will go on throughout the year. Kurdistan, due to its geostrategic position, has been the battleground for different world and regional powers for control and the distribution of resources. Thus, it has been colonized and recolonized over centuries of the march of patriarchal civilization. Some of the best examples of this are the terror regimes of the Assyrian and Scythian empires, or the campaign of conquest by Alexander the Great. The Arab conquest after the onset of Islam triggered the Islamization of Kurdistan and exterminated those who resisted. Then in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols invaded Kurdistan. Flight and displacement followed. The intermittent warfare for 150 years between the Safavids and the Ottomans, with Kurdish leaders, tribal leaders, mostly siding with the Ottomans, led to the Treaty of Kasr-i Shirin. This treaty established the partition of Kurdistan and remains unchanged since 1639, which meant that Kurds found themselves, for the most part, within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Until 1800, relative peace had prevailed between the Ottomans and the Kurdish principalities, which was based on the Sunni denomination of Islam that they had in common. Alevi and Zoroastrian Kurds were defiant and continued to resist. After 1800, until the decline of the Ottoman Empire, there were many rebellions in Kurdistan, and these were usually bloodily crushed. After the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Kurdish partition deepened even further, exasperating the atmosphere of violence. The rising imperialist powers of Britain and France redrew the boundaries in the Middle East and left Kurdistan under the rule of the Turkish Republic, the Iranian throne, the Iraqi monarchy, all backed by the British and the French, as well as the, of course, Syrian French regime at the time. The Republic, the Turkish Republic, switched to a strict policy of assimilation in order to enforce unity of the remaining parts of its former empire. All existence of a culture other than Turkish were to be exterminated. And that they did. The massacres ensued. The Assyrians, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Kurds, pogroms of the Jews. They even wanted to erase that Kurds ever existed, banishing them to a physical existence, and that only if they behave. The Pahlavi dynasty in Iran proceeded in the same manner. The rebellions were crushed harshly. The Shah established a terror regime intertwined with fascist nationalism specific to the 20th century. In the Iraqi and Syrian parts of Kurdistan, Britain and France suppressed Kurdish emancipation efforts with the help of the collaborationist Arab dynasties. Bloody colonial regimes were now established everywhere in Kurdistan. Here, we must not forget European colonialism. Although the Turkish Sultan, the Persian Shah, and the Arab dynasties are not merely victims of European colonialism, but they are also perpetrators. Nevertheless, the role of European colonialism must necessarily be mentioned. Driven by their geostrategic supremacy and boundless greed at the beginning of the 19th century, the European intervention policy became increasingly colonialist. Its primary goal became the submission and control of the Middle East. This added another dimension to the colonization of the Kurds. The British Empire, France, and Germany, although all had friction between themselves and were in competition, in order to have direct control, they played many intrigues. In history books, we see this expressed as the divide and rule strategy of the British Empire. While on the one hand, they incited those, especially the Christian ethnic groups, to rebel against the central powers, they watched the subsequent annihilation campaigns. The same was true for the Kurdish collaborationist aristocracy. While in the past they collaborated with the Arab and Turkish dynasties, they turned to the Western powers to attain their interests and demand their own share. Under these circumstances, the people suffered. There were many massacres, genocides, ethnic cleansing, pogroms, and a huge resistance that continues to date. These new regimes were influenced by the nationalist ideologies and rested on capitalism. The result of this one nation, one language, and unitary state fanatism was a denial and oppression that was worse than ever before. They were left in a continuous state of rebellion, resistance, and thus massacres and enforced assimilation. We see no evidence of the Kurds being considered as humans by anyone in the 20th century. We can summarize this situation as follows. The ideologies of these regimes were that there is no such thing as Kurds, and if they do exist, it's not so important. Why make a fuss? And if you do make a fuss and expose this, you shouldn't, because this is dangerous. Why? Because they say that it has been too long that Kurdistan has been conquered and the Kurds have surrendered. And when all of this meets with the approval of global imperial and colonial powers, Kurds and Kurdistan are reflected to be unimportant, dangerous, and even connected to separatism in connection with terrorism. And all these are day in and out given to all of us in history, lessons, media, films, in everything, whereby they hope to achieve social legitimacy. Thus, not only pave the way for genocides and massacres, but targets a complete annihilation. The Kurds had nowhere to turn to. Their non-existence had been sealed internationally. All these layers of oppression and denial on the one hand, and the approach of Öcalan and his friends on the other hand, is what makes this revolution so profound. So as Öcalan's birth approaches, these are the conditions on the ground. Those that deny the Kurds are well on their way to eradicate the Kurds, because the basis for this is now laid well. So his first birth, the physical birth, where he came to world under these conditions, maybe like millions of people like himself. So he wasn't the only person during that time that was born. He was born in the village of Amara in the Halfeti districts of Rıha, which is Urfa in Turkish, to a poor family. At that time, much had happened and the Kurds and other peoples were left in obscurity. While on the one hand, Rıha was religious and feudalism was very strong. On the other hand, people of different ethnic groups coexisted, like the Kurds, Armenians, Arabs, and the Turkmens. This culture of coexistence was something that Öcalan was always aware of and appreciated. From Öcalan's memories, we are understanding that he's experiencing many contradictions at the time. On the one hand, he has a mother who has a very strong character. On the other hand, a father who seems unable to find solutions to problems experienced day in and day out and is considered somewhat weak. Öcalan, like others in his hometown at the time, is under the influence of religion, but is observing and questioning at the same time. He is rebellious. His mother does not accept him if he is not strong-willed and is not able to show character. Aspiring to being Turkish is severely pushed for in schools. So at an early age, they can be assimilated. While this is the case, the reality at home and in his hometown, his Kurdishness says otherwise to him. The feudal traditions are also imposed on Öcalan. On the one hand, he's pushed to be automatically become enemies with the children of a family his own family has feuds with. On the other hand, he is forced into seeing women inferior. We see from Öcalan's own accounts that in both cases, he's terribly affected and tries other approaches. Despite the pressure and repression, he becomes best friends with the child of that family that his family has a feud with, and could never forget not being able to play with his female childhood friends, which he talks about even today, and the way her sister was given to a man older than her and whom they did not actually know. All of this led him to rebel against the conditions at play in his own village and town. Thus, from the early days, his rebellion includes many elements, and not only the fact that his Kurdishness was suppressed. I guess many of us experience such contradictions if we still manage to remember them. But what sets Öcalan apart is that he saw these contradictions through and did something about them. At the time, he also experienced the contradiction between the rural and the urban, where he felt at the time that the city offered a savior, some sort of freedom. You will find lots of many good quotes about all of this in his books that are also translated into English. Amidst all these contradictions, at home and with himself, he graduated from Ankara Anatolian Land Registry and Cadastre for Vocational High School in 1968 and began working in Ahmed. Both Ankara and Ahmed showed him the colonial reality and corruption. In 1970, he enrolled in the Faculty of Law at Istanbul University. He began to probe into all the different circles in Istanbul at the time, from Islamists to fascists to Marxists. Öcalan remembers picking up a book called The Alphabet of Socialism, and after reading it, he tells himself, Muhammad lost, Marx won. He later quit the Faculty of Law and enrolled in the Faculty of Political Science at Ankara University, most prestigious and most revolutionary faculty in the country at the time. He met many of the founding members of the PKK there, as well as leaders of the revolutionary Turkish left. There he led a student strike protesting the March 1972 massacre of the Turkish revolutionary leader Mahir Çayan and 9 of his comrades in Kızıldere. And Öcalan, I have to say that he was greatly influenced by his ideas as well as other leaders of the Turkish left like Deniz Gezmiş as well. On April 7, 1972, Abdullah Öcalan was imprisoned for 7 months for his role in the protests, but released because of lack of evidence. The 1970s was the beginning of a period in the capitalist system's history when a significant rupture became apparent. The system came out of World War II with having recuperated itself, and the US leadership had gained certainty. Europe was once again on its feet, and in the Far East, Japan was emerging. While the real socialist system was at the apex of its influence, the national liberation movements were at their strongest. At this exact point, the 1968 youth movements gave the start of a new mentality revolution. the socialist, social democratic, and national liberation currents sparked by the capitalist system during its brutal years did not succeed in breaking away from the system. The 1968 youth movement was essentially an expression of this fact. What had been hoped for by everybody had not arrived. All three currents had come to power and been unable to keep their promises. Moreover, a new capitalist class and bureaucracy had emerged from their midst. The crisis of these models and the lack of freedom and equality within them induced the people to look for alternatives. Everyone, including Abdullah Öcalan and his friends, were positively influenced by all these developments and began to change. Thus, the importance of this first birth, his physical birth, is the ability of Abdullah Öcalan to transform himself and to organize and imagine a different life was possible and have the courage to do something about it. Second birth, the birth that came with the foundation of the PKK, is extremely important. And this is where it comes, it's not just an individual transformation and change, but a social one. Following his release from prison and having failed and tried and failed to introduce the Kurdish problem onto the agenda of Turkish revolutionaries, he started working on establishing a separate group around the idea Kurdistan is a colony. The historically important first meeting of this group took place in 1973 in Ankara. They began in April 1973 as a group that could not even be called amateurs. At the shore of a dam in Ankara, this group talked about acting as an autonomous Kurdish group for the first time, reasoning mainly that Kurdistan was a classic colony. They began by talking among themselves, first like a secret, and then in one-to-one conversations with others, and from there took these ideas to the society. But while in the early 1970s, such far-reaching developments were taking place around the world, the Kurdish movement in Turkey had not succeeded in overcoming the classic left and nationalist tendencies. Thus, it lagged quite a bit behind the world. While the left in Turkey oriented itself towards the Soviet Union, China, Albania, and European communism, the Kurdish left was a weak movement of intellectuals and were in a hodgepodge of primitive Kurdish nationalism and Turkish left. The decision taken in Ankara in the spring of 1973 to organize independently proved important. They neither wanted to be a primitive Kurdish nationalist current or to resemble the left currents in Turkey, but they wanted to start with a distinct historical interpretation and assessment of their own existing conditions. They thus called themselves revolutionaries of Kurdistan. This was a clear departure and change in line from that of others, striving for the identity of a free people without succumbing to the nationalism of the oppressor or the oppressed nation was later would prove the right decision. The years from 1974 to 1976 was a period for developing the group. In 1975, Abdullah Öcalan and Mehmet Hayri Durmuş penned the group's first written document titled Analysis of Imperialism and Colonialism. In March 1977, Öcalan traveled from Ankara to Bakure, Kurdistan, to North Kurdistan, and attended meetings in many cities. This trip and meetings were meant as an attempt to carry the groups to Bakure, Kurdistan, to North Kurdistan. After the journey, he returned to Ankara. As soon as he returned, he heard the martyrdom of Haki Karar, and this came as a severe shock to everybody. So their response was not to back off or act in rash, but to take the step and begin to form the party. Towards the summer of 1978, Öcalan and some of the others, they went to live in Ahmed. They dispersed all over North Kurdistan and began to organize people from house to house. In the summer of 1978, The Way of the Kurdistan Revolution was written by Abdullah Öcalan, also known as the Manifesto. Different from other Kurdish organizations at the time, the PKK did not just fight for an independent state, but for a socialist federation of the Middle East. Öcalan recalls and says that even though we were not conscious of it at the time, this corresponded to the transformation that the left subsequently underwent all around the world. This gave their political line the chance to have a real future. This gave them the opportunity to later interpret the principle of the right to self-determination, not as a state for every nation, but instead as democratic confederalism as it is today. This founding declaration of the PKK in 1978 prevented such a dogmatic interpretation. On November 26 to 27 in 1978, a group of 22 amateurs made a promise to one another and to the people in the village of Fes in Ahmed and found the PKK. So as can be seen, there were already many hurdles and obstacles to be overcome until the actual founding of the PKK. And that if the PKK line succeeded, it was due to and closely linked to its ideological aspect. The quick acceptance by the people proves this fact. Had they been infected by the narrow nationalism or the emphasis on a particular class alone, they would have been just as marginalized as many other groups. In the wake of the declaration, the Turkish state carried out massacres and attacks in several cities, and then declared martial law and detained numerous people. In 1979, foreseeing a military coup, which would indeed occur in 1980, Abdullah Öcalan and several of his friends passed through the border town into the city of Kobani in Syria. Furthermore, there were other questions, especially that of where they would be based. Most movements at the time would publish a journal and have an office around that, but they knew that they would not survive for long as a party in the cities under these conditions. The only options available to them thus were the mountains and the Middle East. After leaving Turkey in the years between 1979 and 1998, Öcalan organized and led the political education of the PKK's rank and file, which he considered more important than the military education. At the same time, he also led the movement as a whole, conducted foreign relations, and was responsible for diplomatic meetings, had regular meetings with all the guerrilla forces over radio communication. While doing this, he did his best to stay in touch with the Kurds and allies in Lebanon, Syria, and increasingly around the world. Going back and forth between Syria and Lebanon, where he cooperated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization and met with new and old cadres for the coming struggle, Abdullah Öcalan began making the preparations for a revolutionary people's war against the junta set up after the September 12, 1980 military coup. During the same period, he published the brochure, United Front of Resistance Against Fascism. In 1981, he wrote the books, The Role of Force in Kurdistan, The Question of Personality in Kurdistan, Life in the Party, and the Characteristics of the Revolutionary Militant, as well as the problem of national liberation and the roadmap to its resolution. At the same time, of course, when all this was happening, after the coup, there were several founding members of the PKK captured, and there was a huge resistance in prisons, which gave strength for Öcalan and his friends to continue to organize and struggle. Later in 1982 and in 1983, he also penned works called On Organization and On Gallows and the Culture of the Barracks, the militarization in Turkey and its effects on the Kurds. The military coup resulted in thousands of people being imprisoned and severely tortured, as a wave of severe repression was unleashed against the society. News of disappearances and executions were leaked despite intense censorship. The news of struggle and resistance was also leaked despite all this. As a result, Öcalan's writings in this period focused on how to build an armed organization against fascism, how to fight against the Kurdish landowners and aristocracy who collaborated with the state, and how to transform the Kurdish militants with their oppressed and colonized personalities into freedom fighters. He also made several attempts to build a coalition with the Turkish revolutionary organizations that had succeeded in crossing into other countries in the region. However, internal disputes in the Turkish left, among other things, prevented the emergence of such a coalition. Then on August 15, 1984, the PKK carried out its first armed offensive against two military posts. Thereafter, the PKK began to grow exponentially. This gave such a self-confidence to the Kurdish people that they began to describe the PKK guerrillas something out of this world. As the organization continued to grow steadily from 1987 to 1990, gaining popularity among Kurds and extending its regional influence, new problems emerged. A series of documents with the title Analyses assembled Öcalan's intense discussion of the existing problems. These documents were later published as brochures, including the revolutionary approach to religion and the question of women and the family. These were so revolutionary that people, especially women, came in their scores to the PKK. And he wrote books titled The Liquidation of Liquidationism, The Fascism of September 12, and the PKK's resistance, as well as Betrayal and Collaboration in Kurdistan, among others. The PKK's armed struggle against the Turkish state continued even after the military coup was nominally ended. In terms of the repression that Kurds faced in the region, the banning of their language and their organizations and the denial of their existence, the transition to democracy in 1984 was a non-event. The post-military coup period saw the institutionalization of fascism and neoliberalism in Turkey. From 1990 to 1992, the armed struggle Öcalan led, which he called a war for the protection of existence, gained massive popular support. During this period, Öcalan became convinced that the political solutions to the Kurdish question that the PKK proposed and the strategies it had adopted needed to be revised. This phase saw Öcalan's analysis called "The Resurrection is Complete, Now It's Time for Liberation" in 1993. In these, Öcalan started to conceptualize a radical form of democracy that could liberate Kurds, women, and other oppressed groups. In the early 1990s, Öcalan gave several interviews to Turkish journalists and leftists regarding his search for a democratic solution and efforts to achieve peace, which were published as books later. During those years, his analysis of communality or sociality also left its mark on the Kurdish community, and he published a book called Problems of Revolution and Socialism, or another book called Insisting on Socialism is insisting on being human. And another, The Language and Action of Revolution. And another book called History is Hidden in Our Day, and We Are Hidden at History's Beginning. One of the most famous and one that impacted everybody regardless was How to Live, volumes 1 and 2, and later Kurdish Love. As can be deduced from the titles of these books, at this point, Öcalan was primarily concentrating on two aspects of the struggle. First, how to center on women's freedom and transform the PKK into an organization that can provide freedom not only to its militants, but to the whole of society, the people, and the region. Second, how to deal with the shortcomings of the Soviet real socialist model without giving up on the ideals of a socialist revolution. He also started developing his ideas about history, which he would later return to, as some of you may have read, in much greater detail in what we have called in his prison writings. By the way, let me just point out that these are not written as books, of course, but as submissions to various courts. Öcalan describes his own development and thus the development of the movement in terms of the women's freedom, three phases. He puts the first phase as a phase from his childhood until 1975, where he says that it was a long phase of conservatism for him. One advantage of this phase, he says it protected him and them from adopting masculine norms very early on. The second phase, which is from 1975 to 1985, begins in 1975 when he marries to Kesire, his wife, then his partner. His ability to understand throughout this marriage how the male and female personalities are shaped under colonialism and how this affects everything: war, relationships, the movement, the society, everything. And he drew conclusions from his own experience, which was very harsh and severe indeed. And Öcalan usually talks about the several dimensions of this. The first and foremost, of course, that he did love her and there was great emotions involved. The second was the fact that she came from a collaborationist family. The third, as I mentioned, was the characteristics or the traits that were instilled in them as man and woman and as Kurdish beings. So through this relationship, there was a huge struggle, and it actually paved the way for important developments and conclusions. And as I said, this phase ended in 1985 as Kesire, left the organization. And as well as their relationship, her activity in the organization ended. Now, the third phase is from 1985 onwards. And the actual analysis and the development of the women's movement and struggle within the PKK develops under these, after 1985 that she left. So this has paved the way for many different developments, actually. Öcalan states that the second half of 1990s was when he obtained his own freedom in the sense of freeing himself from dogmatic thinking. During this period, he tried to open up a venue for dialogue between the PKK and the Turkish state. The book Dialogue, Ceasefire, Statements, and Press Releases is a compilation of Öcalan's analysis in the context of the attempts made at dialogue with the governments of President Özal in 1993 and Prime Minister Erbakan in 1995 and Ecevit in 1998. All of these efforts were sabotaged one way or another and did not come to anything. The attacks against Öcalan and his ideas by forces that aimed to prevent peace and democracy in Kurdistan culminated eventually in Öcalan's exile from the Middle East and his eventual abduction in Kenya. The US's multidimensional diplomatic and military pressure on the Syrian state, including Turkey's open threat of war against Damascus and several agreements made between different countries in the region, meant Abdullah Öcalan had to leave Syria on October 9, 1998. And there begins the third birth. Again, very painful, the transformation and the process. I guess this third birth could be called the birth of the democratic civilization paradigm, which is from 2000s to date. So I guess the second birth actually took around about 30 years, and the third birth is now around about 20 years already. So after leaving Syria, Öcalan looked for a new place where he could continue the political struggle and the dialogue he wanted to establish with the Turkish state. The details of the international diplomacy he conducted for a democratic solution to the Kurdish question and peace in Turkey during this period are published as a book titled Towards Peace, the Rome Talks. During this period, the CIA and Mossad pursued him relentlessly. And as a result of the intense pressure applied by NATO and Turkey, different governments forced him to leave their country. After an odyssey through several European countries, Öcalan set off for South Africa, or so he thought. But he was never to arrive there. On February 15, 1999, in a plot that involved several secret services, including the CIA, MI5 or 6, or whoever they were, Mossad, and the Turkish and Greek intelligence agencies, he was abducted while leaving the Greek embassy in Kenya, Nairobi, and handed over to Turkey. The abduction caused protests and uprisings by Kurds in all 4 parts of Kurdistan and worldwide. And the US interventionist policy under Bill Clinton began as such. In 2001, Afghanistan, and in 2003, Iraq was occupied. So we should see all these as links in a chain. It became even more clear and understandable that for such an intervention in the Middle East, they needed to eliminate the PKK, or at least make sure that they are not as organized as they are, and that they are not an obstacle in front of the much talked back then US's Great Middle East project. This grave injustice and indignity imposed yet again on the Kurds met with Kurdish people's anger all over the world and in 4 parts of Kurdistan. Kurdish people had a good memory of their own history. The elimination of their leader would mean a wasted chance for freedom. It would mean their own elimination. Thus, Öcalan became not just the leader of the PKK, but also of the majority of the Kurdish people. Abdullah Öcalan's prison conditions are grim, as we talk, and he is confronted with an arbitrary regime of total isolation. National and international institutions are deadly silent. Imralı Island, where he is imprisoned, is a construct of not only Turkey, but of those powers that handed Öcalan over. It is a restricted military zone located in the Sea of Marmara. Öcalan spent the first 10 years of his sentence as the only prisoner on the island, guarded by more than 1,000 soldiers. In 2009, a new prison was built for him, and there are now 3 other prisoners on the island. All cells in this new prison are designed for solitary confinement. Each of the prisoners has his own tiny courtyard for fresh air. but due to the extreme height of the walls, these yards look like well shafts. Öcalan still cannot receive letters and is the only prisoner in Turkey, along with the 3 others on the İmralı Island prison, that cannot receive their lawyers or family members or have access to telephone. In the last 10 years, the authorities have only permitted 5 meetings with his lawyers and 5 meetings with his family. And these were only made possible by the protracted hunger strikes of several thousand Kurdish political prisoners and people all over Kurdistan and in Europe and around the world. Despite the conditions, he managed to synthesize his political and philosophical knowledge into his books. He continued to prepare his third birth, following on from all the discussions in the period between 93 to 98, and managed to motivate millions of people to transform and change along with himself, and thus gave the movement a new direction. The first was his defense speech in the show trial on the İmralı Island. Everybody was expecting, some other different approach from Öcalan, either a death fast or, that he will not speak on that show trial. But what he did was he named it the Declaration on the Democratic Solution of the Kurdish Question, and he submitted that to the court. And in these writings, he outlined the new strategy that the PKK and other actors in the Kurdish freedom movement should adopt to transform Kurdistan, Turkey, and the broader region without changing existing political borders. This was a shock to everybody. They now had a new political line to follow. Prison Writings, The Roots of Civilization, volumes 1 and 2, as well as the PKK and the Kurdish Question in the 21st Century, both written in 2001 as court submissions, extensively evaluate and critique PKK's shortcomings and failures, as well as it's an extensive historical and philosophical study. Later then came his submission to the Greek courts, which he called Defense of the Free Human in 2003, and that shed more light on his abduction and the role of the various powers, and further developed the ideas he had previously addressed. Öcalan's subsequent writings further delved into and developed his thesis about history and began to map out his alternative paradigm. First, in Beyond State Power and Violence, which he wrote in 2001. And let me tell you, I'm right now working on it. So hopefully it will be out very, very soon. And I urge you to urgently read it. This book played a major role in forming what he calls a new kind of revolutionary party, bringing together ideas from prominent Western and non-Western scholars. He argued for an understanding of history as an antagonism between state formation and society formation. Since revolution is for the empowerment of society, it should also be against the state, organizing in a way that renders the state redundant. Not only the colonial state, but also that we should not target own state. While capitalism, patriarchy, and the nation state build capitalist modernity, he argues that the people's resistance against these systems should build upon the history of democratic modernity, of which the world's revolutionary struggles are the hair. Finally, in his writings, Öcalan also revisited and further developed his ideas on women's freedom and revolution, which he called his unfinished project, and which the seminars that will follow until the end of the year will shed light more explicitly. Putting women's freedom and revolution at the center of all democratic revolutions, he emphasized that women's autonomous organization and ideological production will transform society into a state of equality, peace, and freedom. All these ideas are mapped out in the 5th volume of the Democratic Civilization, Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization, which he wrote between 2008 and 2011. The ideas that Öcalan formulated in prison have greatly influenced and inspired 3 revolutionary projects. The Northeast Syria project, more commonly known as the Rojava Revolution, under the leadership of the Kurds, with the participation of different peoples, including Arabs and Assyrians, is a revolution where the role of women and the youth continues to determine the direction and of the revolution, and which serves as the beacon of hope, not only for the region, but for the world. HDP is another yet project. In 2012, it was founded and brings the Kurdish movement together with other freedom movements in Turkey: socialist, women's movement, ecological movements, LGBTQI+ movements, Alevis, Armenians, and other opposition movements led by the peoples themselves, and which has received the support of 12% of the electorate in Turkey. This is also shaped by Öcalan's ideas. Another example is the Kurdish Yazidi People's Autonomous Councils, formed in the aftermath of attacks, and is oriented towards self-defense and self-government, so the Yazidis are not forced to leave their land and can continue to flourish on their roots. For its part, the Kurdish women's movement, equipped with Öcalan's analysis, not only set a precedent in self-organization and self-defense under the current conditions, but also showed how to translate this into political mechanisms that allow women to exert their weight for a lasting transformation in the Middle East. All of these political actors aim to build democratic autonomous regions in the Middle East, where radical democracy is exercised and they unite in a confederal structure. So at a time when we're going through the structural crises of capitalist modernity, and there are attempts to introduce a new version of fascism, one that Öcalan associates with society side, where the individual is stripped from the society and their responsibilities and doomed to a mere physical existence. However, he also states that this is the end of humanity as we know it. In the last couple of years, what we have experienced is actually no less than the best horror science fiction movies. The appearance of ISIS, and as a result of the environmental or ecological destruction, COVID-19. The invisibility that both Turkey and global powers are imposing on Öcalan is because they want to impose their scenario to be the only scenario, a bloodbath of peoples based on misogyny, religionism sauced with nationalism, and the absolute fascist male being constructed as the paramilitary force of the life that they want to put in front of us. But between 2013 and 2015, even a minimal practice of Öcalan's theory in Turkey and Bakur, in Şengal and in Rojava, showed that this is not the only scenario. People can exist in peace. Women and men can live in freedom and equality. It had become a festival ground, especially in Turkey, but everywhere else during those times. This is why I just want to say that apart from his physical birth, these births have not been individual births. And because of all of this, the trust and the confidence of the society and the women that Öcalan gained allowed these births to occur together. This is why I guess today, despite him being in prison for more than 22 years now, people are inspired by him, and they join him in this long marathon to freedom. This is why I guess people everywhere, and not only the Kurds, are saying Öcalan's freedom is my freedom. Thus, whilst with his second birth is the revival of Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish people, his third birth had universal dimensions. It brought together the Kurds and all those struggling for freedom and equality and a joyful life and a free life. So I want to end it here. I already, I think, talked for very long, but I guess we've talked bits and pieces about Öcalan's life and works. So I wanted to make sure that we have the version in which he himself describes as having three births, fits the occasion, and maybe puts him into perspective a little bit more. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Haveen. That was really, really great. Yeah, there's some questions arrived. Just for everyone to know, I will pass them on to Haveen just now, and she can have a little look at them. And then also, if people are interested, it's been dropped into the chat on YouTube and also on Zoom. There's a link to a website where you can find a lot of the works and books of Abdullah Öcalan. Very sadly, they're not all translated into English yet, though I believe Haveen's on it. But many of them are. And really, really the best way to come to understand his ideas is to read them firsthand and read his writings. So yeah, Haveen, I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at some of our first questions.
Actually, not yet, but I am right now doing that.
And yeah, as Haveen was saying, the seminars that are to come, there'll be one running once a month, all the way up until the end of the year. Before we finish here today, I'll show you the program, and they will sort of go through in quite a systematic way, focusing on like different features to Öcalan's life and also his ideas and theory and what's inspired all these movements, the way that Haveen's just described so well, go into a bit more depth in each seminar about one of these like different points.
Okay, there's a question from somebody called Branik. He's asking about, the claims about the Kurdish liberation movement, about heroin profiteering or whatever. Yeah, it's unfortunate that despite all that I have said throughout almost an hour, Branik is still insistent on this question, but I would like to answer it actually. I think that there's anti-propaganda methods and psychological warfare has been quite proven by other research by others against liberation struggles or freedom movements. So I hope that he can also read these kind of researches as Gladio and NATO, how they actually waged war against freedom movements in general, but of course also about the PKK. And I hope that he can actually do research on this. But I guess, states themselves also lay pitfalls in front of organizations and movements. So I guess this was the case in Turkey in those early days. I've been told that in those early days, and Öcalan recounts this actually quite often. I'm not sure in which of the books at the moment, but that in those early days, the in thing was to actually go and rob banks, to have money so that they could fund their activities and survive, so that they could go to the people and, do propaganda. And this kind of a robbing of the banks was, shown to be okay because, I mean, those banks are of the state and of capitalism, and it's okay to then steal the money from that, rob the banks and whatever. Öcalan especially was extremely against this kind of attitude. First, he said, well, that money is that of the peoples. The second, he felt that this corrupted movements, because if they had money, they could do anything, and thus they didn't need to go to the people. So his very first principle from day one was, to maybe work for that money needed, and people did, like Haki Karar, the first martyr of the movement before even the PKK became a party, worked at the construction sites to earn money. So I guess, there are all these different, I'm going to take it that your intentions are good with this question. So there are traps like this laid, and therefore Öcalan was also extremely careful with that. The Turkish state, the Iranian state, especially, are doing drug trade at the borders that meet Kurdistan. And these are done by the state hands. And there are enough actually evidence, if you go and look for them. And I think just today or yesterday, one of the officials of AKP was arrested, or was, with a lot of drugs in his car. So I think you should really look at these kind of things as well. And I guess these are, old kind of propaganda. I haven't seen anyone prove this, not even Turkey itself or the US. So I guess you should not be worrying so much about this, because after 50 odd years, I'm sure they would have found some evidence of this, right? So
Halim, just on that question as well,
yeah.
One of the friends organizing the seminars has also said that it would be really interesting and something they'd be really up for doing, to organize a seminar specifically about how anti-propaganda works.
I have finished with this already. So, but I think it's important to mention these, and to make sure that everyone is looking at everything in perspective, because there are enough research done on all of this, actually. Mm-hmm. Okay, do you ask the questions, or do I go through
I can read out for you if you
Please
would like.
do, because that'll give me some time to actually understand what the question is saying, and there won't be so much silence, I guess. While I'm reading.
Thank you. There's thanks coming up in the chat as well. Some people say, I don't have a question, just thank you so much. That was very inspiring. Also, thank you for answering that question. We have some questions from Margaret Owen. Margaret asks, saying,
hello, Margaret.
We know the history of the oppression of the Kurds, colonialism, geopolitics, racism, misogyny, and the vested interest in arms sales. The post-Brexit, we forget human rights and we see the paralysis of the UN. So the international silence, Öcalan, is, we can see where it's coming from, asking, what can we do to set him free? Peace depends so much on him. We need to stop the arms sales. Also asking, do we know for sure if he is still alive? And do you think that his writings are seen as a threat by authoritarian states? I guess all these questions are quite connected and coming from Margaret.
Yes, yes. I guess, I try to go into that, why the international arena is completely silent. It's because it's their product. This, forcing Öcalan out of Syria and his abduction in Kenya was actually, orchestrated, as I said, by different intelligence services, both of the US and around Europe, and as well as Mossad. So I guess they saw Öcalan and his ideas and his efforts and the strength of his organization an obstacle in front of what they wanted to develop in the Middle East. And I pointed to, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, as well as Iraq immediately after. So this struggle, Öcalan even led from prison, developing his ideas and trying to understand how this could be stopped, because Öcalan saw that, in the whole world, in fact, the movements were trying to be, organizations were trying to be disbanded, and therefore this was such an attack against himself as well. So I guess what they are seeing him as a threat is the power of his ideas, as I said. The fact that, in only a matter of 2 years, Öcalan could change the whole face of Turkey. People came out and declared how they were, either Armenian, Assyrian, Kurdish, gay, lesbian, or LGBTQI plus, or whatever they were, in terms of their political or their religious beliefs. So it turned into a very, very colorful country only within a matter of 2 years, and where women actually attained a level of organization and visibility that wasn't there in the times before. And now we're seeing, in the aftermath of that collapse of those talks, what kind of a Turkey it looks like. Completely colorless, completely under threat. Women are targeted daily. I mean, it fits perfectly what I said about this, paramilitary, the fascist male stripped off its social, its responsibility and its socialness, and turned into a paramilitary force. This is happening in Turkey. This is happening, especially in Turkey, but in a lot of places. ISIS represented this male. And against that, in the very least of places that was expected, inspired by Öcalan's ideas, and not only by just his ideas, but during those 2 years, his interventions allow the Kurds and those people in the Middle East that coexist together to embrace these ideas and actually put them into practice, as I mentioned. Now, what can we do to free him? One thing is, as I said, they are trying to make him invisible. I mean, this does not conform with any law, neither domestic nor international, neither UN nor the Council of Europe, nor the CPT's recommendations, nothing. But despite this, for 22 years, everybody's silent. This is because they want to make sure the project of turning Middle East into this bloodbath is successful. And that the project that Öcalan is proposing is invisible, that people forget about it, that this becomes the fate of the people and the women in the Middle East. So what do? Then we must make him visible, We must make him so visible that everyone in the world and in Europe knows Öcalan, and does not know Öcalan like the first question, but knows him for what he is, and knows the Kurdish freedom movement for what it is. And of course also knows about his proposals. Because as I said, his proposals has universal dimensions. He has made contributions to the understanding of the state. He has made contributions to defining a different form of nation, stripping nation of nationalism, instead proposing democratic nation as a new form of becoming a nation based on solidarity, freedom, coexistence, and equality between the different nations. And he has also proposed things that instead of a state, how can people actually self-govern? What has the state has actually meant for our world, for our lives, and for our relationships. So therefore, I think what we need to do is increase the Freedom for Öcalan committees around the world. We need to demand, because we saw that this is how Öcalan was not disappeared when he was abducted. The Kurds were everywhere around the world. Even many people self-immolated. But this is how they stopped Öcalan's perhaps execution on his way to Turkey or otherwise. So therefore, today, if we want to make sure that places like the Council of Europe, the UN, the other bodies, NATO, the US, and everybody else is not silent on this issue, we need to make a song and a dance about it. And I think that's a nice way to put it. Yes, let's sing and dance.
Thank you so much, Helvine. Next question here is from a friend living in Chile. Thank you very much. I live in Chile and I've also been in Kurdistan. My medium to long-term goal is to create a democratic and federalist institute at a public university. Any advice?
Oh, wow. Okay. I have no idea what this could entail because, democratic confederalism is something that is very alive, of course. I mean, obviously it has an underlying theory that can be thought, but it's also in development. It's been tried out, developed, tried out, and developed. Therefore, I would really make it something alive. How would you do that? Because democratic confederalism is the governing, self-governing of the people, let's say, maybe not in the whole of Chile as yet, but in a part of a place. Therefore, how would you actually establish these non-hierarchical relations? And from there, actually, implement, making your own decisions. And this between cross sections inside the society as well. Women, youth, other people who define themselves in some other ways, or interest groups, or whatever. So I'm not really sure, but it's an idea, I guess, that needs to be developed. And there are no formulas, I guess, for things like this. This is the beauty of democratic confederalism, I guess. It's not like a dress, one size fits all, but it does have, of course, important certain pillars.
Great, thank you. Now, another question is, Öcalan is often writing about prophets and prophecy, making reference to that in general in his writings. What can you say about this, dear Havin? This is how the question comes to us.
Sure. I mean, I guess, to be able to understand this a little better, one needs to really be from the Middle East. Because prophets and prophecy is a certain period of time in the Middle East, I mean, I guess when we talk about the development of thought, in certain times, it's not just about, and it doesn't just start from, the ancient Greece with philosophy and scientific thought. We have mythology, we have, prophets, the period of prophets, scribes, and you name it. Therefore, I think, Öcalan is doing several discussions over this, with this, One is that, in a critical sense, that people should not actually be in expectancy of someone to come and save you, you know. So Öcalan should not be approached as such, as an ultimate savior. But on the other hand, that one has to deduce results from the lives of the prophets who were, you know, the revolutionaries of their own times, and how they seriously took up these issues. And if you have a look at it all, these are all mostly social issues. And how much did they give from themselves? How serious were they? And to what extent did they go to defend the truth, you know, and not just give up on it once they were cornered or whatever. So as I said, I guess, you know, instead of understanding it in any other way, I think this is the way Öcalan says it, and he gives examples of this. And it's a deep tradition in the Middle East, of course.
Great. Thanks again. That's really interesting. I have a question now from someone joining us with an organization called Radical Women. It says, our politics are revolutionary socialist feminist, in distinction to Stalinism, social democracy, and less movements that duplicate sexist and nationalist prejudices. We look to the leadership of the most oppressed to build a multiracial, feminist, and pro-LGBTQ movement. How does Öcalan's theory answer the problem of capitalism and imperialism's innate oppressive character? How does he prevent capitalism from resurfacing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to really explain the amazing and many years of work this actually took Öcalan, not only in his own self, in trying to understand, you know, his own characteristic traits, but also as the problems arose, you know, in the movement and in the development of the movement and the society, he had to delve really deep into this to find out, you know, what was it that that obstructed the free flow of especially women, but also of the men as well, and how to overcome these. So I guess you know, he did many different what he called analysis, which is in Turkish called çözümleme, which means more than analysis. Actually, you kind of, you know, disentangle, you break it down. So, you know, instead of, he didn't approach it in a manner that, you know, he was very, or not just him, but the leadership was very harsh and excluded people. But what he tried to do was, through these analyses, he tried to make sure that, say, in the personage of me, Havin, if I, you know, had a very bad practice, in analyzing my practice and my characteristic traits that led to such a practice, and doing this visibly and openly, and not as a way of punishing or belittling that person, he allowed for all the militants, himself, and the society to overcome it. And, you know, like, it was, of course, something unique to him, I guess. You know, they would tape record these analyses, and it would be sent all over the world. You know, you'd be surprised how it reached people, and people would listen to this, would understand what the way the shape of this family that was shaped by capitalism and colonialism, the way that it impeded the development of the Kurdish society in general, but also what kind of men and women it produced, or the military service of the Turkish state, what kind of individuals that this kind of produced. So therefore, nobody said that, oh, your likes and your dislikes are yours. This is not the way to go, because then everybody pulls the movement in one direction or another. So what happens is that, though, through these collective discussions, which not only housed the militants or the cadres of the movement, but it also housed civilian people from the society. And these discussions were held together. So as a result, people took things from that and made an effort to overcome these traits that were inhibiting theirs and the societies and the movement's development. And of course, just the final thing, how does the movement now prevent capitalism from resurfacing? I guess what he's doing, and he did this with, not only the women's question or women's freedom and struggle, but with everything, basically, that he doesn't, put his hand over the oppressed and say, oh, you poor thing. I guess he, Abdullah Öcalan, struggled the most profoundly with the woman as well. But at the same time, he became the collective voice of the woman who struggled and, who trusted him because of this struggle and the comradeship that he was showing. So therefore, what he's doing is he is asking for the oppressed to organize themselves, no matter what it is, whether it's the women, the youth, the Armenians, the Yazidis, the elderly, or the ecology movement, or whoever it is, or anyone with a special interest, and feels that that area is being suppressed. Arts and culture, education, because he also thinks education should be absolutely independent, so that it doesn't become a mouthpiece of, some movement or whatever that becomes dogmatic. So therefore, what he's trying to do is, by having these different mechanisms that are organized and are ready to struggle for their own freedom, then he puts all of these in action. I mean, sometimes this co-chair of, the co-chair system is misunderstood. It's as if, some are doing it around the world as well. And it's understood as if, if you have a male and a female co-chair in an organization, institution, or a party, this cuts it. No, the co-chair system is coming from a different background. The woman that is there actually represents not just an individual, but has this organizational force behind it. Therefore, nobody can actually just not mind what that co-chair is saying, or the male co-chair cannot just ignore it. So, and this is the same for the Armenians or the Assyrians, let's say, in Rojava, who are organizing, or the Arabs, So they have their own councils and self-defense forces and etc. So therefore, what one has to do is, like a prophet, maybe, each and every one of us, make sure that we are ready to, head on with the problems, and that we don't back down in the face of our own weaknesses and go into a collaboration with, whether it's male hegemony or something else there. So therefore, this is the way that the mechanism is envisaged, so that not only capitalism, but patriarchy in general does not surface. Because, those of us who are not coming from developed capitalist countries doesn't mean that we have not had our share of feudalism and patriarchy in general.
Okay, thank you, Haveen. We've just got time for one more question, and we've only got a few minutes left. Obviously, it's not always easy to kind of cram things in, so yeah. We appreciate you doing your best. And this question is, some passages in the defense writings about the prominence of Jewish ideology in structures of global monopolies were taken as anti-Semitic. What do you think about this versus Öcalan's actual intention and meaning of his writings? I'm very sorry to say this at the end, we've only got a couple of minutes. But
yes, well, this is actually, I mean, it's of course something that needs to be discussed a little. Obviously, at the time of Kurds being under the clamps of a genocide, as all of you are seeing, and in fact, Öcalan named his last volume as, Kurds under the clamps of genocide. So when he was penning all these volumes of books, I guess Öcalan went into a huge thinking and rethinking about how the genocide and the Holocaust of the Jews came about, to draw lessons from all of this. And I guess, we are at a time where saying some things are becoming extremely difficult, because either you can pink wash yourself if somebody tells you you're LGBTQ plus against them, or if you are critical that you're anti-Semitical or whatever. So I guess we need to understand what the purpose of Öcalan here is. And this is what I've been trying to talk about in many different discussions or topics of the purpose of Öcalan. For example, he has looked at all those who have become the victim of capitalist modernity and the Leviathan of the nation state, including the Jews. And from this moment onwards, he is trying to understand how to actually not only though criticize the aggressor, because this was one of the things that he really fought with the Kurdish society as well as the Kurdish women, that they need to go back and look at themselves in order to empower themselves. Because we can sit here today, or the Kurds can sit and until the morning talk about how bad the Turkish state or the Iraqi state or the Syrian or the Iranian state is. But what the Kurds need to figure out is what they need to do and how they need to organize in the past and today to be able to come out of this trap of being constantly, put through massacres. And I guess, when Öcalan critiqued the Kurdish aristocracy and the tribal leaders and all, some weren't happy either, but I guess we should really understand it with these intentions, that how do we come out of this cycle of this nation, that nation, these peoples or women or this and that being continuously put through genocides? How do we stop this cycle? I would say strongly to look from this perspective, And I guess, you know, the 50-year-old struggle of Öcalan, both himself and the Kurdish people in general, have shown that this to be the case.
Thanks again, Haveen. This has been really, really brilliant. I'm afraid that we're coming to the end of our session now. We could go on all night, I'm sure, asking questions. But thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and perspective and so on with us. I'd just like to say before we go, yeah, thank you everyone for joining, for being here, for your energy. Like, Ocalan's well known for asking people to plant a tree or plant trees on his birthday so that would make something grow. And to my mind, it's great to plant a tree literally, and that we can also see things like this as we're getting together, we're planting seeds, and we will make something grow out of this. You know, this is what we're going to do. We will respond by building something up instead of just responding to what we don't like, to the negative. And so I think this should have worked, that I've shared my screen with you all, which is showing the upcoming seminars. There will be one every month until December of this year. And the next one coming up in May is looking at the PKK and 21st century socialism. So that's the new paradigm also coming from the PKK that Haveen touched on here. We don't have an exact date for these yet, but like stay in touch on all the channels where you heard about this seminar. And as soon as we have the date kind of nailed down, we will get that sent out. So we really hope to see all of you there, and please share it as widely as possible. Thanks again to everyone for coming, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
This is right.